The wind cut across the barren hills of Italy like a blade, carrying the distant rumble of artillery that never truly stopped. It was late January 1944, near the shattered landscape south of Rome, where mud, blood, and steel had become part of the same language. American tanks sat half-buried in churned earth, their engines quiet but tense, as if waiting for a signal no one fully trusted.
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.
Inside one of those command vehicles, Major General Ernest N. Harmon stared at a map spread across his lap, the lines and arrows barely matching the reality outside. The radio crackled again. The order was clear, repeated, and unmistakable. British command wanted him to move forward immediately. But Harmon didn't respond right away. He just looked up, past the map, toward the horizon where men were already dying for ground that refused to be taken. You can almost feel the cold metal of the tank, the tight space, the smell of oil and damp uniforms. Around Harmon, officers waited for his decision. They had heard the order, too. They knew what it meant. Another push, another attack across exposed terrain, another wave of men driving into prepared German defenses. But Harmon had seen enough by then to know something wasn't right. The timing, the terrain, the intelligence, it didn't add up. And in that moment, with pressure building and the clock ticking, he made a decision that would quietly challenge the chain of command in one of the most critical phases of the Italian campaign. To understand why General Harmon refused those British orders, you have to go back a few months, to when the Allied campaign in Italy had already started to slow into something far more difficult than anyone expected. After the landings at Salerno in September 1943, Allied forces pushed north, expecting to break through German defenses and reach Rome quickly. But the German army, under Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, had no intention of giving ground easily. They turned Italy's mountains and rivers into natural fortresses. Every ridge became a defensive line. Every valley became a killing zone. By the time winter set in, the Allies were facing the Gustav Line, one of the strongest defensive positions in Europe. It stretched across Italy, anchored by the town of Cassino and the towering heights of Monte Cassino. German units, including elite paratroopers and seasoned infantry divisions, were dug in with machine guns, artillery, and anti-tank weapons. Any attempt to break through would require careful planning, coordination, and, above all, realistic expectations. But not everyone in Allied command saw it that way. The British Eighth Army, along with elements of the U.S. Fifth Army, were under immense pressure to achieve results. Political leaders wanted progress. Rome was a symbolic prize, and in war, symbols often drive decisions as much as strategy. British commanders, particularly General Sir Harold Alexander, who commanded Allied forces in Italy, believed that aggressive action was the key to breaking the stalemate. They favored repeated attacks, hoping that constant pressure would eventually crack German defenses. But on the ground, officers like Ernest Harmon saw a different picture. Harmon was not a man who hesitated easily. A graduate of West Point, a cavalry officer turned armored warfare specialist, he had already built a reputation for bold leadership. During the North African campaign in 1943, he played a key role in restoring discipline and effectiveness to American armored units after early setbacks. He understood tanks, but more importantly, he understood how fragile a force could become if used carelessly. There was something else about Harmon that mattered in moments like this. He had a reputation among his men for being present, not distant, not hidden behind headquarters walls, but physically close to the front. He would often move forward in his command tank, observing terrain with his own eyes instead of relying only on reports. That habit gave him something many higher commanders lacked, a direct sense of reality. When he looked at a map, he could match it to the ground. When he heard an order, he could immediately picture what it would actually look like for the soldiers carrying it out. By early 1944, Harmon was commanding the U.S. 1st Armored Division, a unit that had already seen heavy fighting. His men were experienced, but they were also tired. Equipment was worn, supplies were stretched, and the terrain in Italy was not suited for large-scale armored maneuvers. Narrow roads, steep hills, and muddy fields limited mobility. Tanks couldn't operate the way they had in North Africa's open desert. Still, orders came. In late January 1944, during operations linked to the Anzio landings, British command pushed for aggressive advances inland. The idea was simple on paper. Allied forces had landed behind German lines at Anzio on January 22, 1944, in an attempt to bypass the Gustav Line and threaten Rome directly. If they could push quickly, they might force the Germans to retreat. But the landing force, under U.S. Major General John P. Lucas, hesitated. Instead of pushing forward immediately, Lucas consolidated his position, worried about overextending. That hesitation gave the Germans time to react. Within days, they began reinforcing the area around Anzio, turning what was supposed to be a breakthrough into another defensive struggle. And as pressure mounted, British commanders demanded more aggressive action from all available units, including Harmon's. The orders that reached Harmon were part of this broader push. He was instructed to move his armored forces forward in support of operations that, on paper, aimed to break German resistance and expand the beachhead. But when Harmon examined the situation, he saw something very different. The ground ahead was not open terrain. It was broken, exposed, and under direct observation from German positions. Intelligence reports indicated strong enemy defenses, including anti-tank guns positioned to cover likely approaches. Artillery fire was already targeting key routes, and perhaps most importantly, coordination between units was weak. Infantry support was limited. Air cover was uncertain due to weather. Communication lines were stretched. In short, the conditions were exactly the kind that turned armored advances into disasters. There is a specific moment often overlooked by many accounts, a moment that adds even more weight to Harmon's decision. Reconnaissance patrols sent forward during those days returned with alarming reports. German 88mm anti-tank guns, some of the most feared weapons of the war, were positioned along likely approach routes. These guns could destroy American tanks at long range before the crews even had a chance to react. In addition, German artillery observers had clear sightlines over the flat areas leading inland from Anzio. Any large armored movement would be spotted almost instantly. Harmon studied these reports carefully. He didn't dismiss them as routine battlefield risks. He understood what they meant in practical terms. It meant that if his tanks moved forward too early, they wouldn't just face resistance. They would be walking into a trap designed specifically for them. He had seen this before. He knew what happened when tanks were sent forward without proper support. They became targets. Easy, burning targets. Crews trapped inside steel hulls, hit by shells they never saw coming. He also knew that once an attack started, it was hard to stop. Momentum, once committed, could carry men into situations no one could control. So when the British order came, urging immediate movement, Harmon didn't just accept it, he questioned it. This was not a simple act of defiance. It was a calculated decision, rooted in experience and responsibility. Harmon was not refusing out of pride or rivalry. He was refusing because he believed the order, as given, would lead to unnecessary losses without achieving its objective. But refusing an order in a coalition army is not something done lightly. The Allied command structure in Italy was complex. American and British forces operated together, but they had different doctrines, different leadership styles, and sometimes different priorities. British commanders often emphasized persistence and steady pressure. American commanders, especially those like Harmon, who had learned hard lessons in North Africa, were increasingly focused on coordination and timing. There was also an unspoken tension between Allied officers at different levels. It wasn't about rivalry in a simple sense, but about trust in judgment. British High Command often issued broader operational goals, expecting subordinate units to execute aggressively. American field commanders, especially those closer to the front lines, were becoming more cautious about blindly following those directives without adjusting them to real conditions. When Harmon delayed the advance, it created tension. Reports went up the chain of command. Questions were asked. Why was the movement not happening? Why was the American Armored Division not following through? But on the ground, Harmon held his position. He insisted on better reconnaissance. He demanded clearer coordination with infantry units. He wanted artillery support properly aligned. He needed to know where German anti-tank positions were located. These were not delays for the sake of delay. They were attempts to turn a risky operation into something that at least had a chance of success. Time passed. And in war, time is never neutral. As hours turned into days, the situation around Anzio continued to evolve. German forces strengthened their lines. Counterattacks intensified. The opportunity for a quick breakout faded. Some critics would later argue that hesitation at Anzio allowed the Germans to trap Allied forces in a prolonged battle. But for Harmon, the question was more immediate. Was it better to rush forward into a prepared defense and lose his division, or to hold, adjust, and wait for conditions that made sense? There is evidence that during this period, Harmon personally visited forward observation points to assess the terrain. Standing near the front, sometimes under artillery fire, he watched how German shells landed with precision on exposed routes. He saw how quickly any movement drew attention. These were not theoretical risks. They were visible, immediate dangers, and they confirmed his instincts that the original order underestimated the enemy's readiness. You can almost imagine the weight of that decision. Not just maps and orders, but the faces of the men under his command. Tank crews who trusted their commanders. Infantry who depended on armored support. Drivers, gunners, radio operators, all part of a system that only worked when decisions were made carefully. Harmon chose caution, not inaction, but controlled action. Eventually, when movements did occur, they were more measured. Attacks were coordinated with infantry and artillery. Even then, progress was slow and costly. The fighting around Anzio turned into a brutal stalemate that lasted for months, with heavy casualties on both sides. The battlefield itself became a place soldiers would later describe as one of the most dangerous environments in the Italian campaign. The flat coastal plain around Anzio, surrounded by higher ground, allowed German forces to fire down onto Allied positions. Mud from constant rain made movement difficult. Trenches filled with water. Vehicles got stuck. And every movement during daylight risked drawing artillery fire. In that context, Harmon's refusal becomes clearer. It wasn't about disobeying British authority. It was about understanding the battlefield in front of him, not just the plan on paper. It was about recognizing that orders, even from higher command, can sometimes be disconnected from reality on the ground. This kind of tension was not unique to Harmon. Throughout World War II, coalition warfare often produced disagreements between commanders. Different experiences shaped different approaches. British forces, having fought longer in the war, had developed certain methods. American forces, newer but rapidly learning, brought fresh perspectives but also had to prove themselves. Harmon stood at that intersection. He respected the chain of command. But he also believed that a commander's duty was not just to follow orders blindly, but to interpret them in the context of real conditions. That belief was not always comfortable for those above him, but it was essential for those below him. There's another layer to this story that often goes unnoticed. Harmon's decision reflects a broader shift in how the U.S. Army approached warfare during World War II. Early in the war, American forces had suffered from inexperience and rigid thinking. Orders were followed strictly, sometimes without enough adaptation. But as the war progressed, commanders like Harmon began to emphasize flexibility, initiative, and critical thinking. They understood that modern warfare was too complex for simple obedience. Communication delays, changing conditions, and unpredictable enemy actions meant that local commanders had to make decisions in real time. Harmon's refusal was part of that evolution, and while it may have caused friction in the moment, it likely saved lives. It prevented a poorly planned attack from turning into a disaster. It bought time to adjust and prepare, and in a campaign where progress was measured in yards and lives, that mattered. As the months went on, the situation in Italy slowly shifted. The stalemate at Anzio eventually broke in May 1944 when Allied forces launched a coordinated offensive. The Gustav Line was breached. Rome fell on June 4, 1944. It was a victory, but one that came at a high cost. Looking back, historians often debate decisions made during the Italian campaign. Could things have moved faster? Were opportunities missed? Were commanders too cautious or too aggressive? In the case of General Ernest Harmon, the question is more specific. Why did he refuse British orders in 1944? The answer lies not in a single moment, but in everything that led up to it. The lessons of North Africa, the realities of Italian terrain, the strength of German defenses, the limitations of Allied coordination, and above all, the responsibility of a commander to protect his men while still accomplishing the mission. Harmon's decision was not about saying no for the sake of defiance. It was about saying no when yes didn't make sense. And that is a kind of leadership that doesn't always get attention. It's quieter. It doesn't come with immediate victories or dramatic breakthroughs, but it shapes outcomes in ways that are just as important. You can almost picture that moment again. Inside the command vehicle, the radio still humming, the map still spread out, the order still hanging in the air, and Harmon steady, thinking not just about what he was told to do, but what needed to be done. In war, those two things are not always the same, and sometimes the difference between them is everything.
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.